In the early years of American television, before reality shows, before cable news personalities, before social media influencers, one of the most recognizable villains in the country was not an actor. No, he was a professional wrestler, and his name, it was Gorgeous George. And in many ways, he helped establish the blueprint for modern televised celebrity. Welcome to RobbDrop's Hidden History, where today we're going to be examining how a flamboyant wrestler in the 1940s and early 1950s may have helped invent the modern television villain, and how he helped reshape American fame in the process. To understand George's impact, we first have to understand professional wrestling before him. In the early 20th century, professional wrestling was widely treated as a legitimate sport. Champions such as Frank Gotch were national celebrities. Matches were reported in major newspapers. Wrestling events drew thousands in an era before commercial aviation and mass broadcast media. However, by the 1920s, the sport began to shift. Lengthy, technically demanding matches, sometimes lasting several hours, began to lose the audience's interest. Promoters responded by fixing match outcomes to increase pace and spectacle. Wrestling gradually evolved from pure athletic contest into structured performance. Yet, even in this early era of scripted results, personality was secondary to competition. But that would change with George Raymond Wagner. You see, what's important here is that George Raymond Wagner understood something that very few in wrestling could fully grasp at the time, and that's that television rewards exaggeration. As television sets began entering American homes in the 1940s and early 1950s, wrestling found itself positioned perfectly for weekly broadcast entertainment. Wagner reinvented himself for that medium, and he became Gorgeous George, the first villain on television. Gorgeous George did not merely enter the ring, he staged an entrance. He wore elaborate styled, blonde curls, a gold fur trimmed robe. He entered to the song Pomp and Circumstance. A valet sprayed Chanel No. 5 perfume around the ring. Rose petals were scattered before him. Before the referee could inspect him, he would shout, "Get your filthy hands off of me!" These details may seem theatrical today, but in post-war America, an era defined by rigid masculine ideals and cultural conservatism, this presentation was intentionally provocative. George presented vanity, flamboyance, and arrogance within one of the most hyper-masculine environments in American culture. Audiences reacted with hostility, but they watched anyway. To fully understand Gorgeous George's impact, it's important to consider the cultural moment in which he emerged. The 1940s and 1950s in America were shaped by post war identity, economic expansion, and strong cultural ideas about strength, discipline, and national confidence. Hollywood icons like John Wayne projected a particular image of American toughness and resolve. Within that environment, George presented something that was visually different. He wore elaborate robes, he styled his hair to perfection, he entered to classical music, he exaggerated his mannerisms. He did this intentionally, which is key to remember. He wasn't trying to undermine what was going on at the time. He was amplifying theatrical contrast, and audiences, well, they responded loudly. Television was still relatively new. There were only a handful of channels. When wrestling aired, it commanded attention. By the early 1950s, wrestling filled multiple primetime programming slots in some markets. Stores would place television sets in their front windows so crowds could gather outside and watch the matches. Gorgeous George became one of the first recurring villains of the television era, not in scripted film, not in cartoons, but in live weekly broadcast entertainment. He built a persona specifically for the camera. Among those watching was a young Cassius Clay, better known today as Muhammad Ali. Clay would later explain the influence directly. As recorded in later interviews, Ali said, "Soon after I turned pro, I discovered that even though I won the Olympic title, I wasn't making any money. I was the only champion that didn't have no jack jingling in his jeans. So I studied Gorgeous George and began doing his act better than he did." He continued, "Wasn't for him, nobody would have heard of me." Muhammad Ali realized something critical. Athletic excellence alone did not guarantee financial success or attention, but personality did. The poetic boasting, the predictions, the theatrical confidence, these elements became central to Ali's identity. and he openly credited a professional wrestler for shaping that understanding. Lee didn't just borrow confidence, he borrowed structure, the predictions, the verbal dominance, the performance before the performance, the blueprint. It was already established in professional wrestling. James Brown also acknowledged Gorgeous George's influence. In his memoir, Brown described George as the wrestler Gorgeous George, one of the greatest early stars of live TV, added a special flamboyance to his matches. Brown specifically adopted the cape routine, a defining part of his stage presence. As noted in reporting at the time, Mr. Brown got the idea for the cape routine, which became like a trademark after seeing Gorgeous George wrestling on TV. Brown also fascinated by George's self-bestowed titles, the Toast of the Coast, Sensation of the Nation. Brown would later call himself the hardest working man in show business, the Godfather of Soul. The idea of branding oneself with grandeur, that template was already visible on wrestling television. Bob Dylan, still performing under his birth name, Robert Zimmerman, also recalled an encounter with Gorgeous George before he became famous. Dylan described George entering a venue where he was playing like a force of nature. He wrote that George roared in like the storm. It was Gorgeous George in all his magnificent glory, with all the lightning and vitality you'd expect. Dylan remembered the entourage, the valets, the women carrying roses, the dramatic fur-lined cape, the sheer presence. George glanced towards him. Dylan later wrote that George seemed to mouth the phrase, "You're making it come alive." Whether George actually said those words, Dylan admitted, didn't matter. What mattered was the impact. Dylan said it was all the recognition and encouragement he would need for years. Not long after, Robert Zimmerman fully stepped into the persona of Bob Dylan. Once again, the pattern appears. Persona, presence, performance, control of image. The blueprint was already visible through Gorgeous George. What makes this significant is not that a wrestler influenced 3 celebrities. It's that he influenced 3 figures who would redefine their industries. Muhammad Ali changed sports promotion. James Brown, he reshaped stage performance. Bob Dylan redefined artistic identity. And each of them, in different ways, absorbed lessons from a professional wrestling villain. Gorgeous George demonstrated something early in the television age. Visibility multiplies personality. Television does not simply broadcast talent, it magnifies character. George understood that exaggeration reads clearly through a screen. He crafted an entrance, he crafted a look, he crafted a voice. He crafted a persona designed specifically for the camera. This was not accidental, it was strategic, and it worked. Professional wrestling is often dismissed as artificial. Trust me, as someone who's been a fan for 30 plus years, I know. But history often shows that the spaces we underestimate often become laboratories for cultural change. Before reality television villains, before bombastic sports personalities, before influencer branding, there was a man in a gold cape who understood the power of televised identity. Gorgeous George did not simply play a villain. He helped define what a televised villain could be. This is RobbDrop's Hidden History, examining the overlooked forces that quietly shape culture. And this, well friends, this is only the beginning. Come back next time.